Okay, we've given some time for people to dial in. It's a quiet call today. Um, what I'll do is I'll open the call, and what we can do is run through our slides. For those on the call, if you have any questions, you can raise them. The purpose of this call is we're looking at the public comment period of the ISO standards, and we'll explain what's going on. This has been covered for North America, Europe previously. We're doing the coverage for North America, Asia on this call. The purpose is to make sure that everyone knows exactly what we're doing with the public comment period. If you've been on some previous calls, you might think, gosh, aren't they repeating themselves? And the answer is yes, we are, because it's very important so that everyone knows how these public comment periods work and how standards are created or updated. These standards belong to you, whether you're on the call or you're watching this recording, and we want to make sure you know how your perspective can be heard on these standards and you know exactly what's happening every step of the way. The first thing we do on our calls is to show the antitrust policy notice. The full antitrust policy can be found on the Linux Foundation website. And if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andrew Updegrove. Now, if you're from a non-Linux Foundation member company, you're on the call or you're watching this call, you can, of course, ask questions of your internal counsel if you have any. But short version, antitrust policies are there to help us all talk openly and comfortably. This call follows a regular agenda. We look at some news, we do work on standards and core material, and we do work or look at reference and supporting material. We have a space for any other business where you can raise any topic related to our work around the project, and then we close the meeting. Let's jump straight into the news. Now, since our last call, the North America and Europe call 2 weeks ago, we've had some big news items out there. The biggest is probably that a German company called IAV has announced third-party certification of ISO 5230. IAV is an automotive supplier, and their third-party certifier, a company called Time to Act, has worked closely with them and also with OpenChain. And we'll have a webinar about what they've done, why they did it, and so on. I'll put up a slide about the webinar in a minute. What I'll do is I'll just throw the link to the news for the IAV conformance into the chat in case you want to have a look at that page. Now, the next thing is our AI study group. They've been meeting for 6 months now. They've done a lot of work in the AI study group. In particular, I think the last meeting was a really interesting workshop. Just put the link into the chat. Basically, they looked at the outcomes of the recent governing board meeting. They did a deep dive into an ISO standard 42001, which is about the governance of AI. And they talked about how on our study group, as we talked about AI, bill of materials in the supply chain, what type of process management is needed, they talked about how we're gradually coming to a common understanding. If people decide to continue building on that, the study group may convert into a work group and work on a guide related to AI compliance with AI bombs in the supply chain later this year. Now, I mentioned the IAV case study. That's happening today in just a few hours. It'll be unsuitable for those in North America, but the timing will work for those in Europe and Asia. Basically, the third-party certifier and IAV will turn up and give some presentations about the third-party certification. This may be useful for you if you're from a company which is considering third-party certification. It may be useful for you if you're simply involved in policy and processes around open source because you can understand more clearly what's the difference between self-certification and third-party certification, what's the overhead, etc., etc. Excitingly, as well as the webinar and a chance to ask live questions, there'll also be a case study released probably later today as well. All right, jumping straight in. Today's call is really about reiterating what we're doing around the standards. And when it comes to our two ISO standards, ISO 5230 for open source license compliance and ISO 18974 for open source security assurance, we have proposed updates to both under consideration in our community. Chris, the chair of our specification work group, has led an outstanding initiative over the last, I guess it was 6 months, Chris, right? The closing of all the issues.
Yes.
Yeah, since the start of the year, Chris has been leading the work group to close all of the open issues on security and licensing. Security is ISO 18974, licensing is ISO 5230. Some of these standards, 5230, have been in market for 5 years. So we had a backlog of issues to make sure we're closed. Security, it's only been an ISO standard since December, but it's been out there for a year and a half. And it also had a bunch of issues. The initiative to close these off resulted in 0 open issues, and that meant it's time for public comment period. On our last call, oops, I apologize, there's some legacy text here. On our last call, we went over the fact that all issues were closed. So we moved into a stage where we discussed the details of the public comment period. And this was a chance for everyone to ask questions. The purpose of this is to make sure that everyone who is interested in the future of our standards can understand exactly the process and what's going on. And this call, because it's targeting primarily Asia, is a reiteration of that as a way for us to make sure the community is aligned. So the specification development process, I'll run through this quickly, and then we can have a space where Chris is available, I'm available to answer any questions, and you can raise any topics related to this. Okay, so diving straight in, we have a development process for specifications. You can find it on our FAQ. The link to our FAQ is in the chat. We have a very clear mandate of what we do. We have a clear vision, we have a clear mission. Basically, we want trusted and consistent process management information. We want that for the supply chain, a trusted supply chain. When we develop standards, we have 4 guiding principles. 1 is make sure that trust happens. 2, less is more. We don't want to make big standards. We don't want to make complex things. We want to define the key requirements for a quality program. Quality license compliance, quality security assurance. What's the key requirement list for that? And we want to solve real pain points, real world problems in the supply chain. We're not interested in theory or perfection. We want to help people bringing product to market every day. We limit our specifications to what and why, and not how and when. What that means is we talk about the big picture items, not the details of implementation. We say things like, check the license of your software. We don't say how you have to do that. We don't say it has to be a manual process using step 1, 2, 3. We don't say it has to be an automated process using step 1, 2, 3. The implementation is up to you. And that's very purposeful because we want to make sure different implementations can be used by companies of different sizes in different markets and different geographies. So we identify the processes. We don't say what should be inside the process. We say, put a process here, and then the implementation is up to you. And we're open to everyone to participate and contribute. That's what's a little bit different about us. Anyone in the world could dial into a call just like this and help write an ISO standard. Now, when it comes to the details of going beyond drafting in an informal way, going beyond the initial phase, we have a development process. And we start looking at the standards, we start considering how to develop them through these calls in our mailing list. We record things on GitHub to make sure that we track issues, ideas, improvements, all of it's put onto GitHub. And we basically have a draft document available on GitHub showing the proposed changes, the future proposed changes to our standards. Once we've reached a point where either we've closed all the open issues or we've closed all the ones we think are relevant to this update cycle, we open a public comment period. That lasts 6 months. So the public comment period opens 9 months before we expect to complete our work, and it runs for 6 months. After 6 months, there's a 3-month freeze period. So that's where we say all the public comments are in, now it's frozen, but there's a 3-month grace period where if something really serious comes up, if there's a concern that someone has, they can come and talk to us. So as you can see, with a long public comment period and a long freeze period, we currently have a process that means there's plenty of time to inform people around the world that these proposed updates exist and for people to either add a public comment or, if they have a serious concern, raise it during the freeze period. And then there's some details about what happens with the public comment and final version and so on and so forth. All of it's in the FAQ, and that link is in the chat. The key reason we're here today is we have opened the public comment period for proposed draft updates to ISO 5230 and ISO 18974. We opened that on June 19th, and that means the public comment period will run for 6 months and close on December 19th. I just fixed the typo there. This is an important consideration for every party interested in what the future of these ISO standards means. Now, the public comment period is not designed to re-edit the standards. It's designed for minor changes, grammatical fixes, and so on and so forth. But it's a period where if you have questions or concerns, you can definitely raise them. In total, we have spent about 2 years looking at ideas for updating the standards. We've spent the last 6 months closing all the open issues. So basically, we've had a 24-month period of creating these draft updates. And now there's a 6-month period to look at them and comment on them. We're not going to go into super detail here, but there's a way to look at the suggested changes to each of them. And I'm going to put the key links into the chat. There you go. The current ISO standard can be seen online, the next generation draft, and the way that all the issues that are open have been closed. Slide down there. And I want to show you very briefly the type of changes that you'll see. For example, one of the biggest changes didn't change requirements, it changed the way we structured the standard itself. A lot of consideration was put into making the read path easier. So ISO 5230 would have a slightly different logic in the way we ordered the requirements. No change to the details of the requirements in this, it's a change to the structure. And you can see that the renumbering, the reorganization is underway, but there's some bugs on the numbering here which we'll fix with an issue, and that's one of the items that this public comment period is for. So a very quick example, look at some of the numbering there. It's a little bit out. So we'll fix that numbering. And the key point isn't the numbering, it's the order of the items, making sure that the order of the items had a more logical read path. Another example of a proposed change is down here, moving slide. Identified licenses, we had a small typo with the endpoint there. That's an item that's also for the public comment period. But the important point is that previously we had a phrasing which made potential interpretation of the sentence that we didn't want. Our intent with identified licenses has been that any open source included in any software is identified. The licenses are identified and you know what your requirements are. In the particular case of this sentence, it was flagged to us that some parties, particularly non-native speakers, might read it and look at the wording, identify open source components from which the supplied software is comprised. It's possible someone could read that as thinking that only software made out of open source components is covered here. And we changed the phrasing there from identify the open source components from which the supplied software is comprised into identify open source components from which the supplied software may contain, to make sure that it was clear we're talking about containing open source. Going on, similar things. We previously had only referenced SPDX because when we started OpenChain in 2015, and when we published our first version of our compliance standard in 2016, SBOMs were not a widely known thing. And truly, it was SPDX that blazed the trail in SBOMs. But in the last 6 years, the market has matured, and now people not only know what SBOMs are, but there's actual regulation requiring SBOMs. So instead of calling out SPDX alone, what we do is we refer to software bill of materials. We explain what it is, and then we reference SPDX as an example. And this reflects the market maturing. Another example is at the very bottom of this snippet. Before we had a phrasing, ensure reasonable commercial efforts have been made with regards to compliance artifacts. And we changed that to reasonable efforts for a couple of reasons. The phrasing reasonable commercial efforts is very common in the US, but not so common elsewhere. Another point is that OpenChain, our standards have grown a lot in terms of adoption. That includes things like governments. A government is not a commercial entity. So we improved language there. And finally, perhaps the biggest change, duration. To align our standards with the concept of an annual or annual cycle update period. Previously, we used double check you're still conformant every 18 months. Aligning with an annual cycle, that would mean changing it to every 12 months in the proposed draft. We could adjust that to every 24 months, every 36 months, based on feedback in the public comment period. The important point there is to move towards an annual cycle because that annual cycle might be more compatible with how people deal with their ISO standards. For example, ISO 9001, probably the most famous standard for quality processes, is 36 month. So every 3 years, it's double check you're conformant with that. Chris, I think that might be the biggest change to 5230. The other changes are minor tweaks. The duration appears to be the biggest. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the duration is probably the biggest, most impactful change we made.
Now, one thing I guess that'll come up, Chris, this will come to us in the public comment period, I'm sure, is the burden of checking. And this is a personal take, and I'm very open to other personal takes. I don't think the burden of checking is very high because you already will have the processes in place. It's really a case of, is a process broken now? But, what's your perspective on that?
I think once a process is mature, the 12-month or 24-month or even 36-month time period is probably a good one to shoot for. But an immature process, for example, as far as having been published and out there for people to formally adopt, like the software assurance spec, it hasn't actually been out there that long. So it can use some maturing. And therefore, you might want to do it no longer than every 12 months. But once it's a more established, of course, the software assurance is a bad one to pick for that because the the world of software assurance is changing pretty rapidly with the advent of cloud, AI, quantum computing, and the things like that, which are going to speed up what's going on in the cybersecurity world. So but it is something to think about. And I don't have any objection to longer periods
That's a
at
really
all.
good point. And I suppose, Chris, you touched on something which might become more and more important. License compliance is a lot more mature than the current state of open source security matters, and maybe all software kind of security with the rapid shifts in what's happening in the market. So
Hmm.
yeah, one thing, Chris, that came up a couple of times in the last couple of years was that there's a chance that the security standard might need more rapid iteration than the license compliance one, because of the
Yes.
market changes. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it centers around those three primary areas that I was just talking about a minute ago. And
Right.
that quantum computing, AI, and and the like. So I think that is something that we should consider and talk about.
This is a bit of a digression, I guess, but it's a point related to quantum computing. One thing that came up, and Chris obviously knows this, but I'm talking to the other parties on the call. One thing that came up recently is that in quantum computing, things like the algorithms we use for encryption will probably be changed quite dramatically, and they have some quantum computing resistant algorithms coming to market. Now, that doesn't read on our standards, but it's the type of example of how anything you pin down today could be impacted by the future. Something as simple as saying, use this encryption standard that we've used for years, but is known to be really, really difficult to break, like AES 256. I believe the break time on that with brute force is about 16 million years. uh, Quantum computing might crack it immediately. So that's where suddenly you have a case of, gosh, we might need quantum resistant algorithms. All of the standards that reference the previous one, we might need to update. That's not our case. We don't reference an encryption standard, but it's an example of the type of paradigm shift in play.
Right. And actually we've been working on that for a number of years now. And some of the new algorithms are actually open source algorithms. The problem with them is that they've been, well, I say problem. Uh, they've been wholly developed using new forms of mathematical approaches, uh, other than using the typical approaches that we've been using for the last 30 years. So you're absolutely right. Some of the older algorithms are going the way of the dodo bird, and they're going to become extinct because they are not able to resist brute force attacks. for example. And a quantum computer's it'll be child's play to break those algorithms.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. And Chris, you just touched on something else. As the market shifts, and again, for those on the call who think, are they completely digression? Is this digressing here? Not exactly. We're talking about the changes that are happening and the type of implications they have. Chris, you referenced the way that the completely new math is being used. And in some ways, whenever someone does something new, especially on something critical like encryption, that's terrifying because if it's new, it means we've had less time to really check for problems. And
Yeah,
it could be broken, but we don't know it yet.
yeah, and that's part of the problem, and it kind of worries me because the first encryption algorithm that I ever wrote in school was relatively simple, and it had to do with moving blocks of text around in certain orders. And then they started doing factoring of prime numbers, especially very large prime numbers. And both of those people have figured out a way of breaking them. So now we've gone off in a different direction, and it's actually a worldwide competition to for people to bring their algorithms in to see if they're strong enough to become winners and selected in the competition, because of course that's prestigious for young algorithm writers.
And to some extent, this type of paradigm shift, but also the consequence of change, is going to impact everything that we see everywhere. I mean, when we're looking, like our AI study group, into changing processes or to creating processes for AI compliance in the supply chain, we're talking about introducing something new. We're talking about looking at something very fast moving, very complex. We're talking about code, talking about data, we're talking about documentation, all necessary for AI. And we're talking about managing that, introducing new processes, um, with an incredible responsibility for the fact that we need more than a bright idea. We need to consider the implications of that. And it's very difficult to consider the implications when something is so immature. Now, in our case, with our existing updates to our standards, as you saw so far, nothing dramatic. I mean, we're looking at reordering, language clarification, keeping up with market developments, like going from SPDX to more generally SBOM, moving from things that could be read as geographic bound, reasonable commercial efforts, very common in the US. Is it going to be the exact right phrase for a government using this in a different place in the world? Not really. So we're changing it. Of course, the fact is that everyone reading this will know what we meant, but the change is just making sure that we're perfectly clear. And duration being the largest change. At this point on license compliance, we're not doing anything that would adjust processes heavily. I guess then the question is, what are we doing on security 18974? Now, Chris and I were going back and forth on the market changes, paradigm changes, things like AI, things like quantum computing. Our standard on security assurance identifies process points. We're not in the maelstrom of implementation challenges. We're not choosing an encryption algorithm. We're not choosing a tool. And that means that we're saved from some of the tension in the market. We're much higher level. And therefore, we're not looking at the implementation, which helps us avoid some of the challenges that standards that delve into implementation do have. But even so, it's worth having a quick look at what we're doing so you can see exactly what we're thinking of. Now, on the security standard, a lot of what we've done, and this is huge credit to Chris, has been making it easier to read. For instance, on section 415, standard practice implementation, none of the requirements were changed, but they were reworded to make it easier to read, especially for non-native speakers. I don't expect you to read this slide, because the slides are sent around to our mailing list. You can access them. You can access them on GitHub. The purpose of the slides is as a reference item, but basically, point for point, everything has the same requirement. It's just easier to read. Moving on, we rephrased things to, for instance, have a clearer understanding. We're talking about a known vulnerability here, and to have an external contact point for for known vulnerabilities. Same requirement, rephrased, particularly small details like ensuring that if you're a non-native speaker, what you land on is the point of known vulnerabilities, an external contact point. The sentences won't have any confusing issues for reading or translation. Now, here we did make a change, 432 security assurance. Chris, again, taking the lead on this one. By the way, if you notice the numbering is different, I'm just going to highlight point. Look, 432 security assurance, 333 is security assurance. That's because on the left you have the old ISO standard. On the right you have our current draft. The ISO standard had an additional section of boilerplate, so the numbering was different. That's not relevant to the content here. It's not a mislabel. Anyway, we talked about what you need for security assurance, the methods or for the process that you'd need for security assurance. And we identified a series of points that are important for looking at things like known vulnerabilities. And we got some feedback from people who aren't very familiar with the security domain saying, I'm a little bit confused about how that type of overarching list could be implemented in practice. And that's perfectly valid. I mean, a lot of people looking at our standards are coming from places like product teams or OSPOs. Maybe their company doesn't have a security team that they can easily ask a question of, or maybe they don't have normal communication with the security team. So what we did was we added a very simple reference here to an existing process out there, NIST SP800-30. So if someone is not familiar with these type of points and thinks, gosh, what is this? They can now see quickly the NIST approach. They can get that as reference, and they can understand more clearly why the steps are listed here. What do they mean? So in other words, we added a reference to another standard as an example. So it's such as, to make sure that people who don't have familiarity with this type of process approach can go and pick that standard up and read it and get their feet. So not changing the requirements per se, just changing the ease of understanding. So on security, the biggest actual change is probably the exact same one as license compliance, duration, 12 months instead of 18. Or to be more accurate, 12 months in the draft, purpose is to go to annual cycle. Alignment with the license compliance and security spec is important, but most importantly, we want to make sure we're matching what the market tells us we need. Just want to pause here and check if anyone has any questions about what they've seen. And you don't have to ask a question now. If you hesitate to do so, you can ask questions via email. You can add issues to our GitHub. Basically, we want to make sure that you can raise your voice at any point in the public comment period, be heard, and get a response. The short version of what you've just seen is that we have these standards in market as ISO standards. We have done a 2-year cycle of looking at them, revising the language based on feedback, with the goal of making it easier to understand. By and large, we haven't changed requirements. There are some phrases that are different, and there are 1 or 2 adjustments to requirements, such as what I've displayed on the call so far. The main change is duration of renewal. And that change is based on getting us aligned with other ISO standards. 18 months was a bit of a weird update period, but it did exist for a reason. When we started, open source license compliance was not something that companies were familiar with, and it wasn't something that companies always prioritized. There was a slight concern 8 years ago that putting us on an annual renewal cycle could get us bundled with all of the standards renewals in a company. And a company might not prioritize actually double checking open source license compliance. In the last 8 years, that has changed. Companies are very aware of the fact that open source is everywhere, and it's very important to respect the third party IP. So anyway, that's why annual cycle aligning with the other ISO standards appears to be a natural and good fit. And the reason we didn't have an annual cycle appears to have passed with time. If there's no further questions or comments on this, I'll just show you what we're doing on reference material. And there's a bunch of announcements around the education work group that are exciting. They've released updates to our supplier education leaflet. They've released updates to our training slides. Formats such as Markdown are available. Formats such as PDF are finished and going out, and those will be advertised more and more widely towards the end of July. But in the last week or so, one of the very cool things was that we had a contribution from UK Workgroup. I'll just put this in the chat because all of the videos are in the link that I just put in the chat in the bottom of this slide. The contribution from the UK Workgroup, Martin Yagi in particular, was to make videos, bite-sized summaries of items from our license compliance management training course that we made in partnership with LF Training. So we made an online course with LF Training about 2 years ago. It's LFC 193. And that course is text and graphics. Martin and the UK workgroup made a series of bite-sized summary videos to accompany the course and provide people with a very quick context for getting started. And that's a really cool contribution. It's been out a couple of weeks now, and it's one example of the type of innovation we see from our community. Anyway, as I said, the work group has done a ton. They've published a lot of new things in Markdown. PDF print versions are coming out, and that's tremendously exciting. So the education material news will continue to be fascinating, and you're reminded that you can be part of making this reference material. Join the education or our main mailing lists and jump in, or do it on these calls. Education also has a monthly call. You'll find that if you go to openchainproject.org/participate, you'll see our global calendar. You'll see the education monthly call there. Pausing now, is there any other business today? If anyone has any topic related to anything we do around standards or our reference material, anything we do around our study group like AI, anything we do around topics such as automotive, telco, etc., you can raise it now. All right. If not, I'll just flag that we have the launch of an SBOM study group coming very soon. You'll be seeing that communicated on our mailing lists and on social media. Probably there'll be a meeting around the end of July. We're just going to confirm that the principals, the main people who've worked on SBOM material in OpenChain, such as our telco quality guide, such as our SPDX Lite creation and contribution, that they can attend the call towards end of July. Ideally, we want to have a kickoff call and then schedule after the August holiday period regular calls for the SBOM study group. We're done here. Thank you everyone for dialing in if you did. If you're watching this online, which is the majority of our audience, if you have a question, don't worry, you can still raise it. Come to our website, openchainproject.org. check out the participate page. You'll find tons of ways to contact us. All right, everyone, thank you very much indeed. And please have a beautiful day. And special thanks to you, Chris, for running late, for being here, and for helping contextualize why we did what we did.
Not a problem at all. And if y'all think of anything that's a little bit more complex than we might be considering for this open period of review of the existing specifications, I would encourage anyone who's got any broader ideas about incorporating for the next round of work that will be underway in what, about a year?
Yep.
And just start jotting those ideas down, because I think there are areas where we can improve on the output of what we've done so far.
Chris, that's a really good point. And that is, so valid. Just if you have a great idea, you can raise it.
And then we can file it in a MD for the next change after this one.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Have a beautiful day. Talk to you soon.
Same to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.